Welcome back to another episode. And tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion of the Kant, or rather the Habermas-Foucault debate, which is going to involve Kant, and in particular the essay, What is Enlightenment? And Habermas's response to Foucault's essay, What is Enlightenment? So there's an essay Kant wrote called What is Enlightenment? And then there's the essay Foucault wrote, which is called What is Enlightenment? And then there's another essay that Habermas wrote in response to that essay. And we're going to be looking at the latter two. So just as I did in the last lecture, I'm going to first go over the texts without much introduction, and then discuss the texts themselves. So the text for discussion tonight really is Habermas's response. And actually, I'm going to be looking at one other text that kind of supports that. So the essay in which he discusses Foucault's essay, What is Enlightenment?, is called Taking Aim at the Heart of the Present, on Foucault's lecture on Kant's What is Enlightenment. And then there's a supporting text I'm going to be taking a look at called Questions Concerning the Theory of Power. So at the end of last week's lecture, I discussed Foucault's essay and kind of gave my take on what I think was most important in the essay. And the two takeaways, the two main takeaway points, are really that when it comes to Kant, the most important thing for Foucault, at least on my reading, was that he flipped the Cartesian way of looking at freedom, which is that you have liberty to its greatest extent when you are reflecting within yourself, when you are thinking and formulating your own judgments. That is a case in which no matter what is happening to your body, you are free in your mind to think as you wish. So you are absolutely free in that capacity. And it's not that Kant's ideas conflict with that, but it's just that insofar as that is something that you would do as a private individual, it goes against Kant's idea about the public use of one's reason. So for Kant, as a private individual, as an individual in society who has to fulfill a certain role, such as being a parent or being a teacher or being a taxpayer or whatever that role might be, Kant thinks that you have a certain duty as a member of society to fulfill that role. However, he also says that you should be allowed as much latitude, as much freedom as you wish to question society and the way it operates in a public fashion. So in your private life, you are under a certain degree of compulsion. You are not really free to the same extent that you can be free, finally, in the public use of your reason. And that kind of goes against the idea that even if you were thrown in prison somewhere, you would still have the freedom to think your own thoughts, which is moving more in a Cartesian direction, a purely self-reflective kind of reason. And really, I'm just throwing it in there as a point of contrast to show how Kant's way of envisioning freedom as something that's public is something, first of all, that has to be granted by society. But given that, the public use of one's reason is an interesting point, is an evolution in the way that Kant is thinking about the relationship between rationality and society. and wherein rationality can be free. So the other takeaway point has to do with Baudelaire, and it's a related point, which was that for Baudelaire, what we find in society is individuals getting caught up in the daily moments of their lives. Sometimes the daily existence of their lives can be less than inspiring. The word that comes to mind is quotidien. Our English word quotidian it's just sort of like people kind of going through their lives without a sense of greater purpose or something grander, bigger than themselves, a way in which the fleeting events of their lives connect with something bigger and grander that might have been more readily attainable to people who lived in a medieval society or in the Renaissance. Because in those time periods, there was a sense of how the earth was connected to the movements of heaven, of the heavens, how all of those things had been created by God, that there was an order to the heavens, there was an order to the unfolding of events on earth. Eventually, there was going to be an apocalypse. And so there was a kind of rationality that was built into that worldview. There was a way in which you as an individual, even as a peasant, could see yourself as connected to something much greater than yourself, a historical process, a connection with God, which was something that was depicted in cathedrals and very much part of the medieval worldview, the Renaissance worldview. Some people say that the entire project of medieval philosophy was actually to try to find a coherence between Greek philosophy and Christian theology, and that harmonizing those two different worldviews was, part of the basic intellectual fabric of that society. It could be said that Greek rationality, in the end, won out. At least, I think there are probably quite a few historians who have argued in that direction. But I'm not going to get too far off on that tangent. But what Baudelaire tried to do was try to find a way back to discovering something of greater significance, something of eternality in the fleeting moment of the present that would be available in a legitimate way for somebody in a modern society. So, and that transcendence of the self in that moment is something that art can do. There's a way that art can bridge that gap to find that sense of wholeness and meaning and purpose. That this is something that art in particular can do, can give our lives meaning by showing us an aesthetic sense of something grander and greater and bigger than ourselves that we can be part of. And in the process, we can form our lives, form our personhood into something that is like a work of art. From my way of reading it, from my way of looking at it, Baudelaire is really trying to form a harmony, to formulate a synthesis in kind of the same sense that those medieval theologians were looking to harmonize two things that might have difficulty being harmonized by the rest of society, which for Baudelaire was just simply trying to harmonize rationality with a desire for something like aesthetic meaning, a spiritualization of one's own existence through the development of one's sense of oneself as a project of building up oneself as a work of art, one's life as a work of art, as a way of negotiating between rationality on the one hand and the deeper, more subjective, more personal need to find meaning in one's life that rationality by itself might not offer and might exclude, especially in the area of the aestheticization of life. So where do we find beauty? Where do we find the beauty of truth and concepts like that we can attribute to our lives? Well, we have to do it ourselves, and that becomes an important life project. Okay, so those are two important takeaways, I think, that are in Foucault's essay on what is enlightenment. And I think you can relate those two ideas together. There's a way in which in your daily life you just got to do what you got to do. But there's also a way in which we as individuals are called to make something more of ourselves, both for Baudelaire and for Kant. And for Kant, it's in the public use of one's reason, being somebody who's capable of working your way up to some social criticism, presenting those criticisms in a public way, discussing them, developing your ideas. And for Baudelaire, simply the work on oneself to develop meaning within oneself. And those are both existentialist ideas to a certain extent. And that train of thought carries through to the last part of Foucault's essay, which is Foucault's advocacy for a new way of doing philosophy that looks at the individual as a project. And if you take it for granted or take it as given that individuals need to do this in our contemporary society, that they need to find meaning for themselves, philosophy should assist them in doing so. And that's the kind of philosophical project that Foucault was interested in. So that's my way of reading Foucault's essay, What is Enlightenment, which I think is an outstanding essay. But when we turn to Habermas's reading of What is Enlightenment, we find something a little bit different. We find a very different kind of emphasis. And what Habermas is interested in really is the points in the essay where it might appear that Foucault is allying himself with rationality. You could say that insofar as or that Foucault seems to be giving some sort of approval, allying himself with this project that Kant is talking about of the public use of one's reason, that he is allying himself with Enlightenment rationality. When you take into consideration that both Kant and Baudelaire are discussed in Foucault's essay as examples of what modernity amounts to and what individuals need to do in modernity, and that Foucault is not turning away from the entire project of modernity, but actually trying to harmonize his own philosophical viewpoint with that viewpoint, the viewpoint of Enlightenment and modernity. It looks as if he's allying himself or trying to harmonize his own point of view with Enlightenment. And I'm putting that out there as a way of trying to connect those two essays, because when I read Foucault, when I read the essay, What is Enlightenment, I don't find him really trying to make his peace with Enlightenment rationality. And the underlying issue here, of course, is that throughout most of his philosophical career, Foucault has taken up this position that we can no longer accept truth as kind of a upper level or higher order principle that's governing discourse, but rather it's something that is buried underneath all sorts of other influences. So truth is something that is embedded in the context of a discursive formation. And that discursive formation is itself embedded within a whole series of techniques that are meant to try to establish relations of power, control, hegemony, and ultimately Foucault sees power as being the dominant regulative idea for these different regimes of knowledge that arise throughout history, instead of the idea of truth as being the regulative idea that's regulating knowledge. So there's an inversion of what might have been considered the classical viewpoint, which is that knowledge is basically the search for truth and has truth as its regulative principle. And that gets inverted. By the time you're finished with Foucault, Foucault might have convinced you that, in fact, truth is not that higher order idea that's regulating knowledge, but knowledge is actually making use of truth. Knowledge is making use of whatever truths it can find for its own purposes. So truth is this lower order concept rather than a higher order concept. Truth is something that's being made use of for the use of society and power relations, a way of organizing people, and a way of finding ways toward better and better modes of social integration. That all comes together in Foucault's idea of a disciplinary society. So there's that inversion there. And so Habermas is looking at Foucault and the kind of writer he's been throughout his career, and he's asking how we can square that point of view with an Enlightenment point of view that advocates rationality and truth as something more like higher order regulative ideals. And those two are directly in conflict with one another. To give some actual substance to this, insofar as how these ideas are presented in the text, I'm going to read a couple of quotations from Habermas. So, first, I'm going to read from Questions Concerning the Theory of Power. So, Habermas says, genealogical historiography is supposed to make the practices of power, precisely in their discourse constituting achievement, accessible to an empirical analysis. From this perspective, not only are truth claims confined to the discourses within which they arise, they exhaust their entire significance in the functional contribution they make to the self-maintenance of a given totality of discourse. That is to say, the meaning of validity claims consists in the power effects they have. Okay, so if we return to this sentence right here, from this perspective, not only are truth claims confined to the discourses in which they arise, they exhaust their entire significance in the functional contribution they make to the self-maintenance of a given totality of discourse. You can see how truth is not the regulative idea, but it's something that is now at the surface, at the service of discourses, a certain kind of discussion that's being carried on in society. And not just a certain discussion, but a way of talking that's been legitimized, a way of talking that extends to the way people do things in society. Okay. And it's not just discourses, but the way that the way that truth makes a functional contribution to the self-maintenance of those discursive regimes, which are also regimes that base their power on knowledge, make use of truth in such a way that truth is not something that inhibits them. It's something that they make use of to maintain their own power, their own standing, their own sense of legitimacy in society. So that's one of Habermas's points about what happens to truth in Foucault. So here's another more direct criticism of Foucault's relativism, which is an outcome of, or is held to be an outcome of, the way that he's looking at truth and how it relates to these knowledge regimes or discursive regimes. So here's Habermas on Foucault's relativism. Thus, the attempt to preserve genealogical historiography from a relativist self-denial by means of its own tools falls short. In becoming aware of its own provenance from this alliance of scholarly and disqualified knowledge, genealogy only confirms that the validity claims of counter-discourses count no more and no less than those of the discourses in power. They, too, are nothing else than the effects of the power they unleash. So, for Habermas, in his way of reading Foucault, everything is subordinate to the interests of power. So when it comes to which discursive formation has more legitimacy, or what social group is backing different types of knowledge which extend to different ways of being and doing things in society, what he points out is that if there's nothing there to regulate which formation has more validity or more legitimacy than another one, but power itself, then Foucault's take on all these things falls back into a kind of relativism that can't lift itself out of that basic ambit, or you might say gambit. It's as though once Foucault has set this structure up, there's no way out. There's no objective ground floor where you can suddenly say, actually, not everything is relative. Actually, one type of knowledge might be better than another, because in doing that, you have to appeal to some notion of truth, which is something that Foucault has resisted, a regulative idea of truth. And if you think about it in terms of a question like, can we suppose that there is some sort of ahistorical, aperspectival notion of truth that we can appeal to as a regulative principle, and then build our philosophy of power around that? It doesn't seem like that project is going to be a very plausible one, or one that's likely to be able to make very much traction. On the other hand, you have somebody like Habermas who wants to say, when you look at the history of the development of science, and I don't know if Habermas has actually made this kind of argument, but it is an argument that you could use in favor of Enlightenment rationality. When you look at the history of science, don't you see some kind of evolution toward better and better theories, more and more adequate theories that seem to be closer and closer to some kind of truth? So both of those ways of looking at things have some kind of initial plausibility. And once you side with the idea that there's no aperspectival notion of truth, and then try to work your way back to some kind of notion of solid ground within the development of history, where you can start saying that this represents a positive development over something else, becomes kind of a difficult project. And Habermas is trying to point out why. He's just trying to say, once you give up on that higher order notion of truth that's regulative, that isn't just in the service of power itself, or didn't just arise through contingent, fleeting historical circumstances. Once you've given into that viewpoint, how can you come back to the other viewpoint that says one type of discursive regime is more legitimate than another? So what Habermas is saying is, once you give up on that idea of a higher order regulative notion of truth, you fall into relativism, and there's no way back. At least that's the way I think you can package it all together in simple terms. And that's where we see Foucault in the, I guess you could say, second half of his career. He's exploring that space, and he's also trying to dig his way out, maybe not fully buy into the perspective that it's all just relative, because that isn't a position that seems very plausible on the face of it itself. So how do you combine both of those points of view? Okay. I'm going to try to find a quote now directly from Habermas's discussion of what is enlightenment in his essay, Taking Aim at the Heart of the Present. So here's Habermas. As Foucault demonstrates, Kant transforms this aporia into a structural principle of his epistemology by reinterpreting the limitations of our finite faculty of cognition as transcendental conditions of a knowledge that progresses on into infinitude. A subject strained to the limits of its structure becomes entangled in the anthropocentric form of knowledge, and this terrain is then occupied by the human sciences, in which Foucault sees an insidious disciplinary force at work. So Foucault, or Kant's initial project, was to try to develop some way in which we as individuals, as rational individuals, can find a basis for ultimate truths in ourselves. He tried to do that with his ethics, and he tried to do it through a transcendental perspective in the Critique of Pure Reason. So without going into what those things were, the next thing that Habermas mentions here is that a subject strained to the limits of its structure becomes entangled in the anthropocentric form of knowledge. In other words, a kind of knowledge that isn't transcendental, but one that's, let's say, more pragmatic, that is more referential to human ways of knowing and being in the world. And what happens in the course of development of modern philosophy is that once we get to Hegel, that transcendental aspect of Kant's philosophy is dispensed with, and we look at the subject as historically determined. And then with Foucault, we are no longer even concerned with subjectivity itself, but more with the discussion of how individuals are constituted within a society. So individuals are no longer really even reasoning for themselves, which plays into the whole discussion of the disappearance of the author, but that individuals are more constituted than things that are constituting. That's that's kind of the direction that Foucault is pulling us in through a lot of his work in the 70s. But then it's kind of interesting what happens here in the essay, What is Enlightenment, that he seems to want to try to swing back in the other direction as subjects constituting themselves, trying to find meaning, and philosophy as there to assist them in that project. Okay, and just one other quote here. Today, it cannot be our task, he says, to maintain enlightenment and revolution as ideal models. Rather, the important thing is to inquire into the particular historical forces that since the late 18th century have both gained acceptance in universalist thought and hidden within it. Foucault opposes the thinkers of order who continue on with Kant's epistemological problematic, still in search of the universal conditions under which propositions as such can be true or false. They are caught in an analytic of truth. In spite of these precautions, it is a surprise to find that Foucault now presents the subversive thinkers who try to grasp the contemporary relevance of their present as the legitimate heirs of the Kantian critique. So what Habermas is pointing out is that Foucault, just to put it in the way that I framed it, Foucault has turned his back on what Habermas calls the analytic of truth, which would be a way that we can just take a statement as being about something in the world, or an analytic proposition in that case, and saying that this is by itself just true. And instead, what he's done is he's taken the viewpoint that begins with disciplines like linguistics with Saussure, and took off in other areas, as seeing those kinds of statements as contextualized. There's a necessity to understand a statement within a context, a framework of signs that together form a system that provide conditions under which the statement can be true. And then Foucault would want to add another dimension to that, which is relations of power that play into the way that those systems are framed. And what Habermas is pointing out is that he's basically turned his back on those kinds of thinkers who want to maintain an analytic of truth. He says, still in search of the universal conditions under which propositions as such can be true or false. They are caught in an analytic of truth. And what we find now is that Foucault presents these thinkers who try to grasp the contemporary relevance of their present as the legitimate heirs of the Kantian critique. So it's like, for Habermas, Foucault is going against his own basic commitments. Habermas doesn't see a way out for Foucault. There's no way that Foucault can dig himself out of his relativism once he has paid the price and laid down his ticket and entered into the relativism carnival. So now I would like to discuss how Foucault might be able to respond. And I do think that some of what Habermas has to say is quite legitimate. But what I'd like to do is just point out that in an essay by Foucault called Truth and Power, I think he lays the foundation for a way of thinking about knowledge and power that is ultimately compatible with the direction that he's advocating for philosophy. Okay, so the main idea that I want to introduce is just the sense in which power actually functions in Foucault's take on history. You can think of power as a kind of substratum, and that these different discursive formations that emerge like different rock layers, like different strata, geological moments in time, as different manifestations of power. Okay, there's nothing revelatory or new about that, and it helps you understand how they're all the same insofar as they are all different manifestations of power. The idea of knowledge is subordinate to that of power because it's really power that is the ultimate foundation. But given that there is this foundation, we can also say that the Enlightenment project is another one of those discursive formations. So it's not like Foucault is just dismissing the legitimacy of the Enlightenment or of rationality or what the Enlightenment stands for. His own way of doing history in order to critique history as ultimately the result of different discursive formations that are manifestations of power or ways of organizing society in order to maintain power, is really just a way of understanding these different discursive formations, and Enlightenment rationality is one of them. So Enlightenment rationality doesn't escape that basic idea. It arises from that substrate, just as other discursive formations do, as other knowledge regimes or discursive regimes do. But there's nothing inherently contradictory in the idea that insofar as the individual in society is concerned, that the individual's prospects in life might be more enhanced by one discursive regime than another. And Foucault also has an aim, a stated project, a stated goal, as part of his unmasking of these different discursive formations as based upon power. What he's doing all of this for is to liberate the individual. So these projects don't need to be necessarily seen as antagonistic toward one another. Foucault's way of doing history is a way of unmasking that helps to liberate individuals. Each individual in society is using this Enlightenment ethos, making public use of one's reason, trying to find, with Baudelaire, the eternal moment in the present, give their life some kind of aesthetic sense of meaning, beauty, purpose. And philosophy, as critique, can work hand in hand with the modern present-day individual who is ensconced in the basic systematic framework that Enlightenment rationality represents. So you don't necessarily need to say, yes, Enlightenment rationality has some kind of way of getting beyond being a discursive formation that's really based upon power. You don't need to try to lift yourself out of that perspective in order to try to find truth as a higher perspective. You can start with individuals within contemporary society as individuals who are seeking those things, but then use critique, the kind of unmasking of discursive regimes and what they really amount to, as ways of assisting individuals in pursuing their higher motives. So I guess the one thing I'm going to do is just throw in a couple of quotes from Truth and Power to give it some extra substance, and then I'll let it go at that. So on page 112, Foucault is saying, the great biological image of a progressive maturation of science still underpins a good many historical analyses. It does not seem to me to be pertinent to history in a science like medicine, for example. Up to the end of the 18th century, one has a certain type of discourse whose gradual transformation, within a period of 25 or 30 years, broke not only with the quote-unquote true propositions which it had hitherto been possible to formulate, but also more profoundly with ways of speaking and seeing. The whole ensemble of practices which served as supports for medical knowledge. These are not simply new discoveries. There is a whole new regime in discourse and forms of knowledge. And all of this happens in the space of a few years. Okay, so if we just pause for a minute in what he's saying here, he's describing a shift from one regime to another. He's saying that the regime happens in a very short space of time. And it involves not just knowledge, but practices, ways of doing, and ways of speaking. Okay, and it's a matter of a complete shift, not just in what people consider true or false, but in the underlying conditions in which something can be said to be true or false. Okay, and so one more quote. The important thing here is not that such changes can be rapid and extensive, or rather that it is this extent and rapidity, or rather that it is this extent and rapidity are only the sign of something else. A modification in the rules of formation of statements which are accepted as scientifically true. Thus, it is not a change of content, refutation of old errors, recovery of old truths, nor is it a change of theoretical form, renewal of a paradigm, modification of systemic ensembles. It is a question of what governs statements and the way in which they govern each other so as to constitute a set of propositions which are scientifically acceptable and hence capable of being verified or falsified by scientific procedures. In short, there is a problem of the regime, the politics of the scientific statement. So those are both good examples. Both quotes exemplify the idea that truth for Foucault is actually a lower order idea, that it's at the service of practices, ways of speaking, and regimes. And I'd like to just throw in one other that relates more directly to the issue of relativism. And this is from the essay Truth and Power in a book called Power/Knowledge. And this is from page 114. So, down at the bottom of the page, Foucault says, history has no quote-unquote meaning. Though this is not to say that it is absurd or incoherent. On the contrary, it is intelligible and should be susceptible of analysis down to the smallest detail. But this in accordance with the intelligibility of struggles, of strategies, and tactics. Neither the dialectic as logic of contradictions nor semiotics as a structure of communication can account for the intrinsic intelligibility of conflicts. So there we have Foucault saying, in effect, that if we take seriously the idea that power is this substrate, as I put it, and that discursive formations are manifestations of power, then we can understand history. So it's not as though history becomes something totally irrational once we introduce the idea. Instead, we have to apply a different set of tools. So with power comes the idea of conflict. And anybody who's read through books like von Clausewitz on war and other such tomes will readily understand that tactics and strategy have a lot of rationality built into them. And so if we read history from a Foucauldian perspective, we can understand these different formations as occurring as an outcome of these struggles, which do have an inherent rationality in them, the rationality of tactics and strategy. And you can see the way that they try to make truth claims and compete against other possible discursive formations in order to maintain their own power as elements of strategy. So Foucault's view of history is not relativist in the sense that it simply abandons rationality. It's just that it's not going to be one that starts with the idea that there's a transcendent sense of truth that's aperspectival or that's somewhere outside of history. But it's going to be one that is embedded within the rationality of power itself. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight.